Well, hello and welcome, Atheist and Christian Book Club members. My name is Daniel Ray. My face probably looks somewhat familiar to you as I've been to the book club several times over the last couple of years. And I have, since in the interim of being part of the Atheist Book Club, Atheist and Christian Book Club, I have become an author myself. And that's one of the delights of our book club is sometimes being able to interact with the authors. And now I find myself in this position. It's kind of weird, kind of surreal. But I am a co-editor and co-contributor of The Story of the Cosmos, which some of you may or may not have. But this video, whether you have the book or you have the time to read the book, or you don't have the book and you don't have the time, this video is just going to be a conversational video explaining some of the chapters that will give you enough information to participate in the discussion that we will be having on Friday, October the 4th at James Walker and the Watchman Fellowship Ministries. So I'm going to run down some basic chapter facts from our book, tell you a little bit about what it is, where it came from, and just go over these in brief so that you can have some information to participate in the discussion. So this book, how did it come together? Well, briefly, it is an outflowing of my master's degree. I studied under Oxford scholar Michael Ward, who wrote this book, Planet Narnia, and this was the book on which I did my thesis. And it's about C.S. Lewis's cosmological vision that Michael argues is behind and a part of the scenery in all of the 7 books of the Chronicles of Narnia. I was fascinated by this book. It's an excellent book. So I did my thesis on it. I went to grad school just to do this. And it was wonderful. I did it just for fun. And so my thesis, out of my thesis, this book has come. And in fact, Dr. Ward contributes a chapter, which we'll be talking about here in just a few minutes, about the differences between whether or not we should call all of that above us space, or whether we should refer to it as heavens, and what does that matter? But after I'd finished my degree and wrote my thesis, I contacted Michael, and I also met a Hubble Space Telescope scientist during the course of my research, doing my research, and I thought it would just be kind of fun if Michael and my Hubble friend got together for one evening to give a presentation about Hubble and to give a presentation about the Chronicles of Narnia. And that event beautifully came together in March of 2018, March of last year. It was well attended, and that was the genesis of the book that I have co-edited and worked on with Dr. Paul Gould, who has just recently written this book, Cultural Apologetics. And Dr. Gould was my contact at the seminary. We had it at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. That's how I met Paul, and that event is where the Story of the Cosmos came from. So that's just a little bit of a background about the Story of the Cosmos. So why the title? What is the Story of the Cosmos? Well, we argue a little bit differently, but we believe we're doing something very ancient. We have a collection of authors from a multitude of different Christian denominations and Christian backgrounds and experiences. We're not just talking about science, but we're telling a story that includes science. Science is part of it. But in the discourse that I've had over the years with skeptics and atheists and other Christians, the universe has predominantly come to be understood as a purely scientific kind of thing. We just think of the math and the science and the telescopes and the satellites and astronomy and cosmology. It all is in the realm of the sciences. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with investigating the universe that way. But it's a very monosyllabic. It's a very monochromatic. It's a very one-dimensional, myopic way of looking at the universe. There are other ways to look at the universe. And so our book brings together a variety of different disciplines. So it's not just science. It's a science, but it's also literature. It's also philosophy. It's also history. We have art. We have a whole chapter on art written by Terry Glaspie, who was the project manager of our book at Harvest House. So we have everything from the intelligibility of nature, a chapter written by Melissa Cain Travis, a whole chapter on meteorites and meteors written by Brother Guy Consolmagno, the Vatican astronomer. We have a whole chapter by Guillermo Gonzalez on what a habitable zone is and what kind of things need to be in place in order for there to be a planet that sustains life. We have a whole chapter dedicated to understanding binary stars from Dr. David Bradstreet, who has been studying binary stars for decades. We have a fascinating chapter on black holes. And of course, just this past spring, a black hole was mostly, for the most part, photographed in the middle of a galaxy, Messier Galaxy M87. So Sarah talks about the background of how we came about our understanding of black holes, and that's one of the chapters that we'll be going over in a few minutes. My friend Wayne does a historical chapter on Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler and how important their faith was in what they discovered. We have Dr. Ward and Terry Glaspie's chapter, and then we have a chapter by Dr. Holly Ordway on Tolkien's Silmarillion, about how Tolkien's creation narrative can help us better appreciate our own story and nature, and help us to see nature in a different perspective. And then we have a classic argument presented by William Lane Craig, Creation ex nihilo, God creating out of nothing. And then another chapter from a cosmologist, Luke Barnes, and someone you may all know, Allen Hainline, who's a local fellow here, who's been to the BBC and has attended Atheist and Christian Book Clubs as well over the years. Alan and Luke combine their forces to write a chapter on the cosmic coincidences of fine-tuning. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then Paul Gould writes a chapter about the philosophical implications of a created universe versus a universe that just happened accidentally. And then I have a conclusion about how you can get started into better appreciating the heavens once more. So we don't claim to be doing anything new. We're actually trying to see things in a very interdisciplinary way. Harvard back in the 1700s, its first motto was veritas. Harvard University, uni veritas means one truth. And so we come at it from a very classical perspective, that the one truth of the universe is that it was created for God's glory, for him and by him and through him, as Colossians 1 says, that the universe is all about Jesus. And so that's the basic overall approach. It's very ecumenical. It brings together a variety of different Christian backgrounds, bringing together a variety of different ways of looking at the universe, not just scientifically. So we have science, philosophy, literature, art, and history, and theology all wrapped up together in this one volume. And it reads like a narrative, like a story. So our proposition is that the story of the cosmos, the univeritas of the cosmos, is that it was created by Christ, for him and through him, and he is the one that sustains all things. So it's not a formal apologetic work where we give you a lot of syllogisms. There's nothing wrong with philosophical syllogisms or anything of that nature. This is a unique approach. It tries to approach it from an interdisciplinary story perspective, and so that's what we're going to do today. Starting with my chapter, my introductory chapter, which is one of the chapters that we will be discussing for our book club. And it starts on page 7. It's the first one, and it's a brief introduction to the rest of the book. And so what I do, instead of saying, well, Melissa Cain Travis writes this in chapter 2, and Guillermo Gonzalez writes this in this chapter, and Paul Gould writes this in chapter 13, and Luke writes this in chapter 12, I actually take bits and pieces of all of the chapters, and I weave them together and try to tell a story about the cosmos. I include poetry, I include art, I include dancing and music, I include all kinds of different subjects, and I weave them together in the introduction to sort of prime your mind to see the interdisciplinary, interconnected nature of the rest of the essays. And so as you read the book, after you read my chapter, hopefully you will be better prepared to see how the other essays fit together. And we have this kind of sub-theme that came out in the book as well, which is something that we didn't actually sit down to do, but it actually developed more and more as I was reading the essays. And so there's this sub-theme of dancing. It really kind of came about. I used to be a DJ, and I used to DJ weddings, and so I kind of look at myself as a layperson. I just play the cool songs. I'm not the expert in any of this. I was just a layperson who has done his homework. So I'm kind of like the DJ, literary DJ. I open and sort of MC everything. And so when I was editing the book with Paul, I sat down, read all the essays, and okay, well, how can I write an introduction that does all of these things justice? And so I begin with Psalm 19. And so notice we sort of begin the book the way Scripture begins with God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There's no theophany. There's no explanation of where God comes from. We assume God from the outset. So we're not trying to establish God's existence. We assume God's existence, and then from that paradigm go forth and say, okay, what is the glory of God that Psalm 19 is talking about? We make that assumption of God's existence and then go from there and try to define and outline in a variety of different ways how the glory of God is manifested to us here on earth. So I begin with a quote from Psalm 19. The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and the expanse is declaring the work of his hands. This is the opening verse of what C.S. Lewis believed to be the greatest poem in the Psalter and one of the greatest lyrics in the world. It was one of C.S. Lewis's favorite verses. And as I said, that this book was generated out of my study of Lewis under Dr. Ward and through Planet Narnia. And so this has a very C.S. Lewis flavor to it, if you like Lewis and fantasy imagination. And this is going to be a good book for you to get into. Of course, that psalm is about 3,000 years old. And obviously, David didn't know everything there is to know about what we know about today, but we don't propose that modern science, of course we don't, that modern science somehow disproves Psalm 19. I argue in my chapter, as we do through the rest of the book, that modern astronomy has absolutely reinforced what the psalmist said 3 millennia ago, that the heavens are indeed declaring the glory of God. And then briefly in chapter 7, I outline, I don't spend a lot of time in it, a couple of paragraphs outlining the basic materialistic assumptions that have been given to us at the popular level. And Neil deGrasse Tyson, Carl Sagan, we go into the secularism, a secular point of view of the universe. Bertrand Russell, of course, many decades ago, saying that everything is just an accidental collocations of atoms. And I quote Sagan and Tyson and several other people in regards to the kind of response that has been out in the popular imagination about what the heavens are. Carl Sagan once described human beings as, quote, inconsequential, a thin film on an obscure and solitary lump of rock and metal. And so we talk a little bit about how over the last 100 years especially, there has been an attempt to sort of demote our specialness in the universe. But what we hope to remind people of in this book is that we are still the only kind of planet with the only kind of people on it that we know of. It's the only kind of sun that we know of that has life going around it. Most suns, actually, according to David Bradstreet's chapter, most stars have a companion. So there are 2s and 3s and sometimes 4s out there. At night, if you can see the Big Dipper at night, you can see that one of the Handle stars, Alcor and Mizar, are actually a binary star. You can see that with your naked eye. At the head of Cygnus the Swan that you can see at this time of year, there are 2 binary stars. You can't see those with the naked eye, but with binoculars or a small telescope, you can see Alberio. Alberio is actually a double star. And Dr. Bradstreet says that 60 to 70% of stars in the universe are binaries. So our sun is unusual on 2 fronts at least. 1, it doesn't have a companion, and 2, it has a planet with life going around it. So, but you hear a lot of times in secular astronomy that the sun is nothing special; it's an average star. But still, the point of the matter is, it almost needs to not be said that the Earth, so far as we know, is unique, and our position and our size do not determine our significance, and that's another argument that we address. But in my chapter, I talk about 2 things, primarily two monumental discoveries that have happened over the course of the last decade or so. One was the Hubble Deep Field that was taken early in the mid-90s by Bob Williams, who was the director of the Space Telescope Science Institute in the mid-90s. He took a risk over 10 days. Hubble's operational cost back then was some $250,000. It cost $250,000 more or less to run the telescope. And so what he decided to do, Bob decided to point the telescope at a blank spot of sky just under the handle of the Big Dipper and take a picture of it for 10 days. So that's $2.5 million, if I'm doing the math right, to take a picture of a blank spot of sky no bigger than the eye of Lincoln on a penny or the head of a pin. And of course, that yielded a very historic photograph that I have included on page 9 there of the Hubble Deep Field. And it's a field of 3,000 galaxies. Mr. Williams had an idea he might find something, but nobody was prepared for that kind of thing. And Williams said this in a press conference shortly after the image was released. He said, what we see here is a myriad of galaxies. There are large ones, small ones, red ones, and blue ones, very structured ones, and also very amorphous ones. Most of these galaxies were never seen before Hubble, but we don't know the significance of all of that yet, end quote. Of course, the myriad of galaxies did not say anything audibly to the astronomers, but of course that inspired further investigation into the heavens. And I think I have this in the chapter as one evidence of how the heavens are declaring the glory of God. The scriptures also say that the heavens speak to us, but not in an audible voice. The glory is known through a silent, tacit kind of speech. So you can just look at the value of the investments that go on, especially with Hubble, at $250,000 a day operational cost. You're looking at something. It says very, very specifically that you're looking at something of great value, and I think just the expenditure operations of Hubble, in and of themselves, over the course of its lifetime in the last 30 years, I think upwards of some $10 or $11 billion have been spent in operational costs. Or more, I don't know for sure. But that expenditure just on Hubble indicates that we're looking at something inestimably valuable in the heavens. So that is part of what I think glory is. I define what glory is. The word kabod in Hebrew, it means weighty, like wealth and renown. King Solomon was filled with kabod. A president or a king or a celebrity, we might think, has some kabod. It's a hard word to translate, but it means glory. And so God's kabod is expressed to us through what we can see in the cosmos. But I also talk about one of the things. One of the enjoyable parts of my chapter is that I brought together. I talk a little bit about William Herschel, who discovered binary stars. William Herschel, in the 18th century, with his sister Caroline, discovered 848 sets of binary stars. What was funny about Herschel was that he used, not funny, but really interesting, that he used to be a composer in the English town of Bath, if you're English, and he used to write music for ballroom dancing that occurred in this resort town. It's kind of like a Branson, Missouri of England or something, where people go for vacation. But of course, Bath is mentioned in Jane Austen. That's where a lot of the scenes take place, is dancing and ballroom dancing and balls at Bath. So Herschel was a music composer as well as an amateur astronomer. And I quote a line from Jane Austen in my chapter. It's from Pride and Prejudice, where Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth are dancing. And Elizabeth says, quote, "It's your turn to say something now, Mr. Darcy. I talked about the dance. You ought to make some kind of remark about the size of the room or the numbers of couples." Now, why did I throw that in there? Well, because I think that is the uniqueness of the heavens and the earth, this theme of dancing, two opposites kind of coming together. How do these things relate? Man and woman, heavens and earth, and especially God and man in Christ Jesus. And so it's very unique. The woman has a perspective on the ball, and the man has a perspective on the ball, so that science and imagination, reason and imagination can go hand in hand. And so the Jane Austen quote kind of gets you, alludes to that. It makes you think of that. And then I also go into the other Hubble discovery that happened a little bit after a decade or more after the Hubble Deep Field. We have the Hubble Extreme Deep Field, which was taken by Hubble, a similar procedure, blank spot of sky, no bigger than a pinhead, in the constellation of Fornax, 10,000 galaxies in that spot. And both of these images combined had caused us to reconfigure how many galaxies we think that are out there, scientists. But I also include not just those things, but poetry. I liken our fascination with the heavens to a verse from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem about a blacksmith. I can't speak. And it says, "A children coming home from school look in the open door. They love to see the flaming forge and hear the bellows roar and catch the burning sparks that fly like chaff from a threshing floor." So we argue that the heavens, we love to look at them. We're inspired by them. They're beautiful. They're awe-inspiring. They cause governments and educational agencies to spend billions of dollars in building satellites to investigate what it's all about. They inspire us to write. They inspire us to create. They inspire us to endure. They give us delight. There are all these things. And so my chapter essentially tells a story, and part of the assumption is that story isn't just science. That story, Carl Sagan was an excellent communicator, and that's why Cosmos was so popular, is because he was such a popular communicator. He could bring things together. This is an immensely long-lasting cultural entity of cosmos. I mean, everybody that you talk to about the universe, at some point, Carl Sagan will come up, because he could speak with an interdisciplinary understanding of the universe. He combines lots of different things. Of course, we disagree with his materialism, but he was a gifted communicator, and he knew he was a planetary scientist, and he understood what he was talking about, and he made it very appealing. He brought it down to earth. If you've ever watched Cosmos, even now, 40 years later, it's still very much an appealing thing to watch. So we hope that our book can give you that perspective, but from a Christian perspective. How would a Christian do Cosmos? Well, that's what we are trying to do here. So my chapter talks about the story that is being told, and I begin with Psalm 19. And so you might want to be able to flip through that and see how you might agree or disagree with whether or not this is the best way or a good way, or to talk about the universe through written and through visual communications. So that's what we do there. All right, so I'm going to go through a second chapter, and now we're going to talk about Sarah Salviander's chapter 6, and that's on page 91. Now, Sarah, through her study of black holes, she came to know Jesus. She came to Christ through her study of black holes. She grew up in Canada and was an atheist, and came to Christ through her study of astronomy. She got her PhD in astrophysics from the University of Texas at Austin. She was a researcher at UT for 16 years, where she specialized in the study of quasars, supermassive black holes, and galaxies. And she has authored several peer-reviewed journal papers and a comprehensive astronomy and astrophysics homeschool curriculum. And she's very active on Twitter. She's currently writing books about the remarkable confluence between Christianity and modern science. You can find her bio on 242 of our book. But her chapter is on the history of black holes. And we actually, as she was writing this was just before our book came out in July of this year. And it was in April of this year that the black hole in M87 was discovered. Sarah starts her chapter off by saying, "The end of the universe is not a time, but a place. With this knowledge, some people may imagine that if the universe were finite and had a boundary, it must be unimaginably and comfortably far away. The truth is that the end of the universe is only 26,000 light years away, light years from Earth. It exists in our Milky Way galaxy and lies in the direction of the constellation Sagittarius. But if you look there, you won't see the end of the universe. It's invisible." Of course, what she's describing is the black hole that is believed to be at the center of our Milky Way, and indeed at the center of most every galaxy that is out there. But she goes into a wonderful synopsis of the history of black holes, not only telling us what a black hole was, but how difficult it was in the 60s to actually conceive of what was going on with a black hole. So without getting too detailed into the nature of a black hole, I can just briefly give you the synopsis that if, black hole was, if you look at space-time fabric, you think of a sock, right? It's kind of stretchy. Space-time fabric stretches, right? So if you put if it stretches, if I put something heavy on this, if I put a ball or something, the stretchy material will go down and down eventually. Well, a black hole is like something so supermassive that it just continues to stretch space-time so infinitely. There's no end to it. Like here you can see a little curve, and this is, just say a massive object sitting in the space-time fabric, but that's what massive objects do. They sort of bend and warp and twist the space-time fabric. The heavier something is, the more warping and twisting there is. But with black holes, you can't see anything. There's nothing there, but you know that space is being warped by this. And the warping is so dense that there's actually, conceivably, that it's infinite, that there's no end to this warping of the space-time fabric. And so it was very inconceivable for a lot of people who were pondering this in the 60s. She talks about Robert Oppenheimer and several other people who were talking about the conceptual problems of black holes. So Sarah talks about 4 failings that act as great barriers to the pursuit of human knowledge. And she relates these 4 failings to human nature in general. It's not just about black holes, but these are things that can prevent us from understanding who God is as well. So I want to briefly point out what these four things are. She says every person, even the greatest of scientists, is susceptible to the four human failings that act as great barriers to the pursuit of knowledge. She talks about Sir Stanley Arthur Eddington and Robert Oppenheimer. They could only go so far in the quest to understand collapsing stars because they had reached conceptual and emotional barriers they couldn't overcome. Though he faltered at times, Wheeler, who is the man responsible for the black holes. Yes, she quotes John Archibald Wheeler. I actually quote Wheeler in my essay, who coined the term black hole, who passed away in 2008. Wheeler says, quote, "The world is a crazy place, and the way it is organized is truly crazy. But if we have to be crazy enough to see what that way is, if we're really going to understand this physical world. It's not just a matter of nice, simple formulas." And so Sarah talks about how Wheeler succeeded where others failed by overcoming the four failings. He, despite the conceptual oddities involved with a collapsing star and black holes, he was able to follow the physics to the very end, and his ability to overcome an emotional aversion to black holes when the mathematical evidence demanded it. So Dr. Salviander, Sarah, talks about an emotional aversion being a barrier to understanding. Something seems foreign to us, something seems difficult, something seems even crazy, as John Archibald Wheeler says. But those shouldn't necessarily be barriers to further understanding our concept of the universe. And Sarah quotes Einstein, who once said, quote, "The eternal mystery of the world is its comprehensibility. The fact that it is comprehensible is a miracle," end quote. And then Sarah quotes Psalm 19 as well, talking about the heavens declaring the glory of God. And so in the chapter, let me find what the four steps are here for just a second. I had it marked. Okay, so what are the four barriers that Sarah talks about? One being a limited perspective. We all kind of recognize this is an obvious point of our humanity. We are limited. The second is misleading emotions. We can be emotionally opposed to something, but that doesn't mean that what we are emotionally opposed to is necessarily true or untrue. I think a lot of Christians and a lot of atheists will argue from a position of emotions. We want to cling to what we believe, and sometimes that becomes a barrier to further understanding one another. And so there's limited perspective, misleading emotions, intellectual inertia. In other words, being so satisfied where you are, you never examining what you come to believe. And then a lack of humility. A lot of us struggle with this. I did. I mean, being an author of a book, you're like, yeah, I got a book, right? Humility is difficult, especially when we're defending our positions. Sometimes we mix up defending our positions with defending ourselves, and it becomes a defense of ourself, a defense of what we believe, rather than a defense of what is true. And so those are the four things: limited perspective, misleading emotions, intellectual inertia, and a lack of humility. Those are the four things that Sarah argues prevented people from seeing black holes, and she combines that and says these are the things that also prevent people from understanding who God is in the person of Jesus. And so that's a great chapter, and those are the things that will probably come up in discussion, I think. There's a great deal of history about the black holes, and Sarah goes into detail about how she sees these four things in the scientists who are working on black holes at the time. And then she concludes that with the chapter with, "The science of black holes is what delivered me from atheism, convinced me that God exists, and set me on a path that ultimately led to Jesus Christ. The need to understand the magnificent, mysterious, and invisible forces at play in the universe revealed the ultimate truth to me, just as the Bible promised." And she says, "One beautiful day, summer day, as I was walking across campus, I suddenly realized there was no way the universe could have just happened without a conscious cause. I had the sense that some great intellect had created a universe complete with black holes and left its fingerprints everywhere. Without warning, the scientific evidence had turned me into a theist and then eventually a Christian." So that's Sarah's chapter, a great chapter. And as I'm getting feedback from people on social media, this is one of the favorite. It continues to be one of the favorite chapters. So if you only read one chapter, read hers. It's great. It's very readable. There's no hard, complicated science in there. It's very readable. It reads like a story. It's great. Let's go and talk a little bit about the cosmic coincidences of fine-tuning. Allen Hainline and Luke Barnes. Of course, some of you may know Allen. He's been to a few book clubs. And Luke Barnes, who's been on the lecture circuit and who is a world's leading expert in cosmological fine-tuning. A lot of people don't like this argument. There's a lot of debate on what it means, and there's a lot of deep philosophical implications of what we're looking at. What do these mean? What is this fine-tuning? What's it all about? Aren't we just making this up? What is the physics saying? So there's not only scientific implications, but philosophical implications that can run very deep in many different directions. And Luke and Allen do an excellent job of distilling it down into the very basics. What do you need to know about the argument from fine-tuning, and what does it say about the glory of God? So if you have your books, you can turn with me to page 203, where this chapter begins. So fine-tuning, it's a bugger of an argument. There's a lot of debate, as I say. There's a lot of discussion and debate that could take videos and books. In the 1980s, there was a book published called The Cosmological Anthropic Principle that really started the ball rolling. It's very deep and complex and offers a lot of science. We could get into that. There's certainly a lot to explore there. But they start off the book with a quote from Richard Dawkins. On page 203, the chapter begins, "The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music." Now, I know that all atheists think like Richard Dawkins. We understand that. But the quote was chosen because it encapsulates a lot of what the new atheism and a lot of what many atheists in social media will espouse, that everything is just a random, accidental byproduct of chance. And so it's interesting, here's the dance theme again. Are we dancing to the music of DNA? What does that mean? So is Dawkins right? Is the universe just, aside from what you might think of Richard Dawkins, is that conclusion true? Is all of that no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference? Is that true? Is that the best explanation for what we see in the universe? Is DNA just is? What is that as an explanation? So Allen and Luke unpack this. And their beginning response is, "This famous quote shows a scientist's instinct. A crucial question to ask of what any scientific theory, from atoms to zebras, is this: if it were true, what would we expect? For example, if the Earth's landmass were once a part of a single supercontinent, would we expect today's continents to fit together like a jigsaw puzzle? If the solar system was formed from a swirling cloud of gas and dust, we would expect all the planets to orbit in the same direction. If our kids really had cleaned their room, we would expect them not to panic when we announce, 'I'm coming in to check.' And so, if the story of the cosmos had no author, what would we really expect? If matter and energy in space-time are all that exists, with no purpose or design, what kind of physical world would we expect? Any old universe seems to be Dawkins' answer, and a universe as if chosen at random." So basically, first of all, what is fine-tuning is not saying, this is a straw man I see a lot and hear a lot, the argument from fine-tuning is not saying that the universe was created just for us. That is not what it's saying. It was not created just so that people could inhabit a single planet in a galaxy. That is not what the universe is for. That's not what the argument is saying. But oftentimes atheists will claim that is what the argument is all about. That life is the whole point of the fine-tuning argument is that the universe was created just for us. But it wasn't. I mean, you can look out there and you can see that that we're it in terms of biological life. So far as we know, we are it. There's nothing like our planet out there. Maybe we shouldn't even call ourselves a planet. Maybe we're something in a biosphere or something. But it's not, the argument is not saying that the universe was designed specifically and especially for us. I like to use the example of the Burj Khalifa in the United Arab Emirates in Dubai. The idea that the tower can certainly be inhabited. It's the largest skyscraper in the world. But it was built to be inhabited, that's for sure. But it wasn't built specifically for the inhabitants. That was a secondary thing. But what it was built for was the glory of Dubai, the glory of the kingdom. That's what it was all about. The secondary nature is that it can be inhabited. That's part of the glory, but that's not the main reason for the universe. And so Scripture declares that the whole point of the universe, from a Christian perspective, is for God's glory. So that's what the universe, as a Christian, I believe, and that's what Orthodox Christian theology teaches, is that the universe was created for God's glory. Part of that glory is that the universe is habitable, at least where we are. And so the fine-tuning argument does not argue that the universe was made primarily for us. So that's one thing we need to get out of the way. So having said that, what is this? Is it just a God of the gaps argument? Because that comes up. That's the secondary thing. Well, Luke and Allen give a wonderful explanation on page 205 of two kinds of explanations that are perfectly legitimate and perfectly reasonable. The first one is this analogy. Books have authors. So we could ask this. Why does Harry Potter go to Hogwarts? Because Hagrid, keeper of the keys at Hogwarts, takes him there to begin his schooling as a wizard. Second, why does Harry Potter go to Hogwarts? Because the author, J.K. Rowling, wanted to write the story that way for artistic reasons. And they go on to say, these explanations don't exclude one another. We do not propose an author of the gaps when we infer from the coherence of the plot to the ingenuity of its author. These explanations apply at different levels. Likewise, I can say, what is this cup of coffee doing on my desk? And I can, explain coffee by scientific means. I can talk about the biology of beans and the mechanisms of coffee machines and boiling water on a stove, and all that's perfectly legitimate. But there's another perfectly legitimate reason for this, and it has to do with me. I put it there. That's why it's there. I poured it in the cup. I drank it because I like coffee. And so a lot of times the straw man argument that comes from the skeptical side of things is that we're arguing that fine-tuning is a God of the gaps. But no, it's explaining mechanistically how coffee is made through the machines and boiling water and all that kind of stuff doesn't do away with the fact that I made it. So all the fine-tuning argument is saying, at the bottom level, all the fine-tuning argument is saying is that the universe permits life. And that's it. And so what are those key things that lead to this life-permitting place that we inhabit? And so Alan and Luke break it down. They both are men with children. And so they say we both enjoyed playing Legos as kids and playing with Lego as kids. And now as parents, we have an excuse to play with them as adults. Yay, I love Legos too, but I don't have kids, so I don't have Legos. But I still probably should. Every once in a while, I'm tempted to buy a Lego set. Suppose you were to see an advertisement for a new construction toy with the following features. It ships within a tiny volume and weight, but over time it expands into larger size. No assembly is required because it self-assembles into cool toys that can fly, swim, and run. These building blocks can form a variety of highly sophisticated machines. They can even replicate themselves so that you can share toys with others. They require no batteries because they harness energy from the environment. They are completely recyclable. Existing toys can use old toys to make new toys. Would you believe it? And so they use that analogy to lead into the very specific characteristics, the more very specific distilled characteristics of what constitute fine-tuning and what raises eyebrows in the physics community. And so they do a great job on page 207 and 208, some bullet points, four simple bullet points that break down what some of these, what they call constants and quantities of the universe actually are in very down-to-earth language. So number one, if gravity were a repulsive rather than an attractive force, in other words, if I lift a book, and instead of the book dropping, it would go up. If that's what gravity was, the universe would not have collected into large, complex structures. You need gravity to condense and to collapse things and to keep things together. Of course, that's what a black hole does. It's a condensation so dense that everything flows around it because of its mass. And so the attraction between two massive bodies is what we're talking about with gravity. And without that mass, without the weightiness, you don't have a condensation and a collection of things going around one another. So the universe would be uniform and structureless without planets, stars, or life, and that's just gravity. So number two, the opposite electrical charges repelled and like charges attracted each other, then electrons, so you have protons, neutrons, and electrons on the outer shell of an atom. The electrons would be pushed away from the positively charged atomic nuclei, and so chemistry would not be possible. You wouldn't have the periodic table of the elements if these charges were switched. The nature of their charges were switched. So chemistry would not be possible. Positive charges and negative charges would form separate, featureless conglomerations. The strong nuclear force, and what that is that it keeps the force that keeps a proton and a neutron tightly compacted together in the nucleus of an atom. It's the glue. The strong nuclear force is the glue that holds the nucleus of an atom together. Where a long-range force, such as gravity or electromagnetism, if it was not what it was, if it wasn't as strong as it was, then the only structures formed would be uniform, spherical, undifferentiated lumps, not suitable for the formation or storage or replication of the type required by intelligent life. So the very precise nature of the strong nuclear force keeps the nucleus of atoms together. And without that strong nuclear force, you don't have atoms and you don't have anything else. You don't have chemistry. And then he goes into the electromagnetic force. The electromagnetic force was discovered by John Clerk Maxwell. The equations are standard fare in physics. Electricity and magnetism and light are all kind of the same thing. Without the electromagnetic force, there would be no atoms and molecules. There wouldn't be galaxies whose formation relies on electromagnetic cooling of gas clouds. And there wouldn't be stable stars, even if they could form at all. So those are just some of the basics. There's a chart here I'll put up on the video. This is a little bit more complicated. This is from a paper that Luke wrote on fine-tuning that you can find online. This comes out of a paper that he wrote against Vic Stinger's book. I think it was The Fallacy of Fine-Tuning, that Luke spends a lot of time on his blog, Letters to Nature, about his response to Victor Stinger. So this chart shows you a little bit more detailed, if you're a little bit more physics-minded, of the constants and quantities that go beyond what I've described here in the book. And they don't get that detailed in the book, but the beauty of their chapter is the simplistic language. It gives a brief history. It talks about matter and antimatter. It talks about how galaxies are made. It talks about what supernovae are, atoms and chemistry. And then it gives, at the conclusion, it gives answers to objections of the fine-tuning argument. On page 215, you see that the fine-tuning argument, unsurprisingly, has been subject to criticism. And indeed, there's a lot out there. For example, how can we know that God would want, or whether God is likely to create life? In reply, it is important to put this uncertainty in context. In the game of poker, suppose a cheater were to defend himself by saying, "You don't know me. You don't know if I'm a cheating kind of person." And they go into several different analogies that are very easy to understand. And another common objection is this, and we'll close this summary with this chapter. There is nothing surprising about fine-tuning. This is an objection, because observers could only find themselves in a universe supported by the existence of observers. This is related to the anthropic principle, a term with a variety of contradictory definitions. And so they talk about this idea that, well, we're here, and we wouldn't be here to talk about this if we weren't here. If the conditions weren't right, we wouldn't know. And so, but this doesn't explain where we came from. This is only just stating the obvious point. The objection is that, well, because we're here, we can explain it, or because we're here, we know it's here. So the objection is they say that they give an example of the philosopher John Leslie, who gives an excellent illustration of this point. Suppose you're about to be executed by a firing squad of 50 marksmen. Ready, aim, fire, yells their commander. As the smoke clears, you discover they've all missed. You're still alive. You could just shrug your shoulders and say, if they hadn't missed, I wouldn't be alive to wonder about it. A more rational response, however, would be to consider the possibility that all the marksmen missed on purpose. And so they go into the objections on a very simplistic understanding. So if you don't know anything about fine-tuning, if you're unpersuaded by it, I think if you find the arguments too complicated or too mathematically difficult, or there's too much Bayesian probability involved in this, this is a fantastic down-to-earth chapter for the layperson on the arguments themselves. And of course, I conclude with a caption on page 218. I wrote some of these captions, but this is great. I write that, is the universe fine-tuned for life? Why does the universe seem fortuitously to smile on our existence? This question has puzzled physicists for decades, and the answers keep getting, in Lewis Carroll's words, curiouser and curiouser. This is the Cheshire Cat galaxy cluster. It is a cluster of galaxies that warps and bends the space-time, and thus the smiley face. There's so much mass there that you can see the light that's bent there is coming from behind the warped mass of the space-time fabric. Well, I've often seen a cat without a grin, thought Alice, but a grin without a cat. It's the most curious thing I ever saw in all my life. And so in 2009, some astronomers and cosmologists discovered and named the Cheshire Cat group of galaxies in the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. So the image above combines X-ray and optical observations. You can see curved streaks around two central elliptical galaxies. These are distant galaxies, and the light from them has been distorted by gravitational lensing, the bending of light by a massive foreground galaxy as predicted by Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity. So there's all kinds of things like that, and that's just one example of how the universe is intelligible. The fine-tuning argument, as you saw on the screen earlier, there are a lot of numbers, constants, and quantities for which naturalistic theories of the universe have no definitive answer. It's a great mystery. So that's the cosmic coincidences of fine-tuning. Okay, so now we will go on to a chapter from my professor at Houston Baptist University, Michael Ward. On page 149, Michael's chapter is Imagine There's No Heaven, ? Imagine There's No Heaven, and that comes from John Lennon's song, of course. And the subtitle of the chapter is C.S. Lewis on Making Space for Faith. And the chapter goes into great detail about the etymological differences between using the word space to describe what is above us or using the word heavens, and what that sort of does to our conceptual framework and our own thinking. How is there a difference? Is it necessary? What is space? What does that mean when we say space versus the heavens? I mean, you just think about it. If I say space, what do you think? You think of storage space, square footage space, empty space. It's just nothing, right? That's the sort of the connotations and the implications of the word. There's nothing there. But heavens, on the other hand, when you think of the heavens, well, you instantly think of God and magnificence and light and wonder. And as you can see from some of these images here, that the heavens are not empty. You might argue that they are. There's a lot of distance between us. There's 2.5 million light years between us and our nearest constellation neighbor, Andromeda, and that all seems to be empty. But when you look up above, if you're in a dark sky, just right here on the ground on Earth, you can see upwards of 2,000 to 3,000 stars. There's galaxies, there's stars, there's nebula, there's planets. We spend billions and billions of dollars every year, billions and billions, studying what's out there. And if it was really empty, what are we making an investment in? What are we spending our money on? Nothing? Empty space? No. I mean, if you've seen the pictures of Jupiter or from Juno, or you've seen Hubble pictures, you know that there's nothing up there. So Michael Ward, through Lewis, argues whether or not space is the best word for that. That seems kind of esoteric maybe, but I think it's important because as we talk about it throughout the book, language is a very important means of communicating the truth of reality. We use words and tell stories all the time. And so it's important for us to be consciously aware of the kind of words that we use when we're describing things. And they can, over time, influence how we think about things. So Michael begins his chapter talking about Yuri Gagarin, the cosmonaut who is the first to have orbited the Earth. In 1961, the Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man to travel into space, as well as the first man to orbit the Earth. His Vostok 1 spacecraft was launched on April 12th of 1961, and the entire flight took less than 2 hours. In recognition of his achievement, Gagarin was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor. 50 years later, in 2011, the United Nations marked the event by declaring April 12th to be the International Day of Human Spaceflight. As Humpty Dumpty would have said, there's glory for you. One interested observer of Gagarin's pioneering adventure was, of course, a certain professor of medieval and Renaissance literature English at University of Cambridge, C.S. Lewis. In a letter he wrote shortly after Gagarin's flight, Lewis described this first journey into space as, quote, exciting, a reaction he might have been expected to have given his long-standing interest in interplanetary travel. But his more substantial response to Gagarin's historic voyage came 2 years later when he published in an American periodical an article entitled Onward Christian Spacemen. Lewis opened the piece by writing, quote, "The Russians, I am told, report that they have not found God in outer space," end quote. It was a report that left him unperturbed because finding God, quote, by astronautics was, in his view, impossible. Quote, "The methods of science do not discover facts of that order. What is required is a certain faculty of recognition. Much depends on the seeing eye," end quote. And then Michael goes on to say that the report by the Russians that they had not found God in outer space originated, so Michael understands, with remarks made not by Gagarin, not by Yuri Gagarin, but by the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. So Khrushchev historically put words in Gagarin's mouth, so to say, who told a meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party that, quote, "Gagarin flew into space but did not see any God there," end quote. But it wasn't long before Khrushchev's words about Gagarin were attributed to Gagarin, thus misrepresenting Gagarin's own Christian belief. But why would the Russians think that God might not have been found in outer space? I suppose it must be because of the opening line of the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples, which, as we know, runs as follows: "Our Father who art in space, hallowed be thy name." Or perhaps the Russians were thinking of the first verse of the Bible: "In the beginning God created space and the earth." And so the whole chapter unfolds with the etymological difference between these two things and what they mean for us. But I point out Gagarin's, the Soviets, Khrushchev's remark about not finding God in space. You hear this a lot in social media as a general common popular objection to science disproving God, that somehow our telescopes, our satellites have not found God. They've not seen God. Therefore, they have better explanations than people that wrote the Bible, and so science somehow disproves God because we haven't found him. This is a straw man God of the gaps argument, but it demonstrates that the assumption would have to be that you would think a telescope or an astronaut or a rocket or a satellite would have the inherent capability of seeing God in the first place. If the telescope is going to disprove God, it must be equipped to be able to detect him. But there's no satellite or telescope that I know of that was built that way. Nobody at JPL or NASA has ever built a telescope or a satellite with a God detector on it. So the assumption that science disproves God relies upon the tacit assumption that science could actually prove God. And you can't use scientific tools to prove or disprove God's existence. And so that's just one argument that's been around a long time, long before Yuri Gagarin. But Dr. Ward goes on to talk about what Lewis meant by new astronomy. Lewis believed that our mathematical, scientific penchant for understanding the universe emptied the universe and created space. We keep reducing things, like explaining a star purely by its material constituency, down to its atoms and nuclear processes. That moons are just dust, planets are just rocks and dust, stars are just dust, galaxies are just dust. Everything is just dust and gas. Everything is just lumpy and metallic and dirty and dusty. And then there's mostly empty space in between it. We've distilled everything down to the periodic table. We can explain everything in terms of matter and energy and dust and grains and things, and everything has been reduced to virtually nothing. And in fact, modern cosmology talks about the universe coming from something like a quantum vacuum, which for all intents and purposes is virtually nothing. So there seems to be this tremendous reductionism that Lewis talks about. And he wrote about this in the introduction to his English Literature in the 16th Century, Excluding Drama, in 1954. It was a preface to this, and Lewis called it his Oh Hell book, because that's what English Literature in the 16th Century, Including Drama, the Oxford History of English Language, the OHEL. But in the preface, in the opening, he talks about briefly how we went from Copernicus in 1543 to the modern day, that we've been constantly looking at ourselves mathematically, reductionistically, increasingly in a lifeless sort of immaterial space kind of way. So space was, Lewis argues, was this gradual development that really began with Copernicus unintentionally. But the more we began to see the universe mechanistically, the more we started to see ourselves that way too. If stars and suns and planets and all that beauty and wonder above us is just gas and dust, then what are the implications for us? And so that's Lewis's argument there in the chapter on Imagine There's No Heavens. So this is the quote that Dr. Ward has, and this is from Lewis, and it says, "By reducing nature to her mathematical elements, the new astronomy substituted a mechanical for a genial or animistic conception of the universe. The world was emptied first of her indwelling spirits, then of her occult sympathies and antipathies, finally of her colors and smells and tastes. Kepler, at the beginning of his career, explained the motion of the planets by their animi motrices, motive spirits. Before he died, he explained it all mechanically." Now, Lewis is not saying that we're going back. He wants to go back to a time where he thinks gods or spirits inhabit things, or angels. He's not talking about this. But what he is saying is that the repeated and continued emphasis upon mathematics and a reductionistic scientific view of the universe emptied the universe of God, really. That we used mathematics to basically replace God. And so laws of physics, mathematics became, for the skeptic, the materialist, became causal agents. But of course, mathematics, the number 7 or the number 2, they don't cause anything. They just describe things. But what slowly happened, Lewis argues, over time, since Copernicus, is that we increasingly, the modern sciences began to see physics, the laws of physics and mathematics, to replace God as an explanation for everything. But that goes back to earlier what we were talking about with baristas and coffee. You can explain coffee by mechanistic means. You can talk about the science of boiling water and all that, but it doesn't do away with the barista, the personality who ultimately caused it. And so Lewis argues about that, and Dr. Ward also talks about the word cosmos, which we find actually in the Gospel of John. In John's opening chapter, John talks about the Logos, Jesus, the Logos, the logic, the arranger, the arrangement, or the God. That word was prevalent in Greek time, and John used it to his advantage when he wrote the opening of his Gospel, that the Logos, what the Greeks would have known as the organizing principle behind everything, created the cosmos. But that Logos was God. That Logos was Jesus Christ. And John's Greek says the Logos created the cosmos. And the cosmos, or the cosmos, is arrangement. That's what it means. That's where we get cosmology and cosmetology and cosmetics from. We arrange ourselves in a certain kind of way. We put on shirts and jewelry and makeup and whatever we need to. That's cosmology and cosmetology, cosmetics and all these kinds of things. So the universe is an arrangement. And the Logos is primarily the ultimate final cause of that arrangement in Jesus Christ. And so, but it's interesting, in John's Gospel, it says that the Logos, Jesus, created the cosmos, but the cosmos did not know him. And it says that in John 1:9 that the light shines, his light, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. And so the idea of cosmology, cosmologos, is the modern word of cosmologos. It's exactly what John is talking about. Cosmo and logos, the organizing principle, the study of the cosmos, logos and cosmos. A lot of the scientists have the word logos in their biology, those kinds of things. So it's really interesting that the discipline of cosmology speaks into exactly what the ancient texts say, that the cosmos was created by the Logos, and indeed we are still studying it. Now, Michael Ward goes on to quote Lewis, who says, Dr. Ward says, Lewis does not concern himself with scientific basis of a modern model. Lewis is only interested with the terminology used to convey it and with the imaginative and emotional effects thereof. So Lewis isn't so much arguing from a scientific perspective as he is looking at language. Lewis was a professor of literature and languages. And so Dr. Ward quotes Lewis as saying, "To look out at the night sky with modern eyes is like looking out over a sea that fades away into mist, or looking about one in a trackless forest. Trees forever and no horizon. To look up at the towering medieval universe is much more like looking at a great building. The space of modern astronomy may arouse terror or bewilderment or vague reverie. The spheres of the old present present us with an object in which the mind can rest, overwhelming in its greatness but satisfying in its harmony." Lewis was a big fan of the aesthetics of the medieval model of the spheres. He didn't think the spheres were actually true, but he said there was an organizing capacity that tied heaven and earth together, and it was aesthetically beautiful. Everything had a place. And he's not saying that crystal spheres were true or the medievals got their science right. He's saying that the interdisciplinary way of looking at the cosmos has been lost since we've tried to reduce everything to its material constituency. There's no, how does it all connect? And I think that's what people want to know. We're drawn to the universe. We want to see it all. What does it all mean? But when we look to the sciences for meaning, we find that everything is reduced to virtually nothing. It comes from nothing. It's virtually empty. It is nothing. And so we struggle to find unity or meaning or purpose in it. We're just sort of looking out at an endless horizon and wondering, ontologically, what are we doing here? Teleologically, is there any purpose to it? And Lewis argues that the modern mechanistic ways of looking at the universe have reduced and effaced our own story in the cosmos. And so that's Dr. Ward's chapter on C.S. Lewis and Imagine There's No Heaven. He goes on to quote Milton and a lot of other of C.S. Lewis's science fiction writings. And it's a fascinating chapter. If you have a moment to really enjoy it, and if you're a Lewis fan, you would love this. And one thing I want to conclude with Dr. Ward's chapter, he uses a wonderful example from the Chronicles of Narnia itself that talks about this. This is Lewis being very simplistic in his idea of addressing the materiality and the materialistic understandings of the cosmos. So Ward writes, in Lewis's third book in the Chronicles of Narnia series, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Eustace, a boy from England, meets a character named Ramandu, and who in that world, in Narnia, is a star and has trodden the great dance in the sky, looking down on everything from above. Eustace says to Ramandu, quote, "In our world, a star is a huge ball of flaming gas," quote, end quote. Ramandu replies, "Even in your world, my son," Ramandu says, "that is not what a star is, but only what a star is made of." And Dr. Ward goes on to say, this is a pithy encapsulation of Lewis's whole case against materialistic reductionism. Eustace is an unwitting exponent of the mythology that follows in the wake of science. And what does Lewis mean by the mythology that follows in the wake of science? The mythology that follows in the wake of science is simply this, that stars are just a ball of flaming gas. And just to bring this home more concretely, in Sunday school a couple of weeks ago, I've been teaching creation Sunday school to adults lately. I asked everybody the same question, what is a star? And immediately, what all of the respondents said, they started with this scientific understanding of a star, but from a very biblical, and that just pervades our culture. We just think scientifically about gas and dust and plasma and everything else. But the first and foremost way to think of stars is that they declare the glory. As Dante says, Dante's quoted several times in our book, especially the last part of the Paradiso, where he says, it is love that moves the sun and other stars. And we argue in our book that that still holds true, that the narrative of the cosmos is God's loving act toward us and toward creation, his demonstration of his love toward us. And then he steps into what he has created and suffers in our stead, suffers with us, suffers as a man for man. And that's the wonderful uni veritas, the very story of the cosmos. So that is a synopsis of those 4 chapters. And that is really all I have time for. I think that those really hit the high points of what we're talking about in the book. The other chapters are certainly super interesting on their own and just as fascinating in the different facets that they present to us. But with those 4 chapters, you should have plenty of background knowledge to be able to participate and enjoy our conversation on October the 4th. So thank you for joining me. Thank you for taking time to have some coffee with me and chat about the story of the cosmos. And we will see you at the book club. Thank you.